Welcome to the first Park seminar of the year. I'm James Jordan, so most of you will know me. I'm the new director of Parks, a great privilege and a great honour. As it is probably an honour to introduce Simone to you. And Simone's going to speak to us about a close yet distant suffering, the Holocaust survivor diaspora in, I'm just going to say, New Zealand, and trajectories of visibility. Thank you, Simone.
Great. Thank you so much, James. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation from Sammy and Emily, and from James and Claire and everyone who's here tonight. So start talking about the survivor diaspora in New Zealand, and I'll bring up why this is important to me. I didn't get this tattoo in Cuba Street. This reference to Wellington's creative quarter with its bars, cafes and tattoo parlours by Hunker Pressburg, a Czech Jewish Holocaust survivor and immigrant to New Zealand, provided a singular provenance to her Holocaust past. It also geolocated the profound in-betweenness of her past European life and that of her adopted country, an immigration nation of incredible diversity and extreme remoteness. Hunker's post-liberation route from Bergen-Belsen to Wellington diverged from the Jewish displaced persons from Poland and other Central European countries who comprised the surviving remnant in the DP camps of occupied Germany and Austria, though her wartime experiences belonged to that group. Hunker first publicly shared her story alongside her friend Roma Herman to an audience of just over 2,000 people at the 40th anniversary commemoration at the end of the Holocaust, the 40th anniversary commemorations at the Michael Fowler Centre in Wellington on the 5th of May 1985. This was the first national event of its kind. The interviews introduced Wellingtonians to the faces of the camp survivor and away from the well-known histories of Jewish refugees from Europe, whose arrival during the 1930s averted the core destruction. These interviews were followed by the journalist Kim Hill's interviews with Hunker and her friend Roma Herman and Fred Silberstein in 1990, well before the USC Shoah Foundation's interview team from Australia crossed the Tasman Sea and conducted interviews with the survivors in December 1997. This paper proceeds as a thought piece into the memory infrastructures, events, and testimony sharing that contributed to the public visibility of the Holocaust survivor community in New Zealand between 1985 and 2015, situated between self-disclosure and invitation. This visibility and accessibility were apparent in designated rooms and memorial spaces, museums, testimony-giving initiatives, and commemoration events in the media, and in the testimony of the survivors themselves. Hunker Pressburg from Rakovnik, Stephen Sedley from Budapest, and Inge Wolf from Vienna. These are all kind of married names. I'll speak more about that in a moment. Each of them a survivor of the Holocaust. My own positionality is relevant here, since for many years I was based in Wellington, New Zealand, at Victoria University of Wellington, and it was involved with the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand and with Hunker, Stephen and Inge for many years, and I helped drive their operations and ambitions. So although this talk focuses on activity in Wellington, there are many survivors all over the country, which I will show you in a moment, and particularly in Auckland, and there was pioneers of Holocaust remembrance. Among them were Bob and Frieda Narev and Fred Silberstein, who as a teenager was abducted from the streets of Berlin by the Gestapo, brought to the Wannsee House villa. He worked there as domestic servant before being transported to Auschwitz, and then he provided deposition for Robert Kempner's prosecution cases at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. So the emergent visibility of Holocaust survivors in New Zealand during the 1980s and 90s, and obviously it goes well back to the 1930s and 40s, but I'm concentrating on the post-war, the recent era. This was preceded by an unfortunate stream of negative associations. So how Holocaust remembrance came into being, public visibility was partially through negative associations. In the persistent provocations of the convicted denier and irritant, as we know him, David Irving, right, and in Australia and New Zealand, and in well-known cases of Holocaust denial in New Zealand universities, which resulted in several high-profile investigations into academic standards and integrity. The lack of scholarly publications that affirmed the history of the Holocaust and the post-1945 survivor community included the resettled saved remnant, has been assumed by scholars and educators and others as an absent history, something that doesn't kind of exist or is a silence. And it's an assumption that's not dissimilar to the criticism that Hasier Diner levelled against Peter Novick and others in her 2009 book, We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust. These are just some of the publications that have come out, positioned in the global kind of context on the left, which I'll talk about, and in the centre, the local publications. There is one exception I would like to introduce, Judith Berman's Transnationally Minded Holocaust Agendas, Conspiracies and Industries, and it's a comparative study of memorialisation practices in Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom. Published in 2006, it was a response to Americanisation debates, or rather American-centric debates, about the contours and chronology of Holocaust memory, advanced by Peter Novick, Tim Cole and Norman Finkelstein, that alleged a weaponisation of Holocaust memory in the service of so-called American Jewish elites to the detriment of scholarship, public understanding, and the very real material needs of the survivors worldwide. Berman argued that these assertions needed testing or investigation in diaspora communities in Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom, where factors including geography, the small size of the population, particularly in New Zealand, and the survivor diasporas, or rather dispersion within, and the attitudes of the host country shape the profile and patterns of Holocaust memorialisation. What she recalled then, that Australia and New Zealand have received little or no attention in scholarship, has changed somewhat. Both countries appear in content tables of books such as Global Approaches to the Holocaust, which has come out, an aggregator of research about non-European countries that does not practice any significant comparative approach or transnational method. And Australia and New Zealand remain narrated within their own national borders in that book. Geographically structured, though with some fluidity, is the approach of Holocaust memory and racism in the post-war world, which explores the Holocaust connections to and early conceptualizations of discourses of racism and anti-racism. This assessment does not include so-called ego documents, such as memoirs, collections, letters, reflective literature by Jewish refugee children and Holocaust survivors. Except for Berlin, most published research, whether by scholars based in New Zealand or internationally, about New Zealand's Holocaust survivor diaspora, and I include myself in that because I've published on the Jewish refugees as well, and shifting in this direction. And the kind of focus there has looked at musicians, architects, writers. So this is by my colleague, a book about Maria Dronka, the actress. We have writers from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia as the dominant national groups. And they include the stories of Richard Fuchs from Germany, the architect Ernst Pischke, Karl Popper, Minnie Maria Dronka, and others. There's many others. So the temporal and geographic distance between the so-called old and new world communities is often unduly exoticized in exile research. This book at the top on the right. This is the kind of life stories. This tone is apparent in the otherwise Lives Remembered project from the National Fund of the Republic of Austria for Victims of National Socialism, whose 2 volumes on New Zealand with 20 life stories was published in 2022. The historian Anne Biegelhold, herself a Jewish refugee from the uprising in Hungary in 1956, estimated the immigration and sponsorship of mostly juvenile refugees in New Zealand between 1933 and 1949 to be around 1,100, including kinder transportees. For Australia, the equivalent number was 7,000, rising to 9,000 through the arrival of Jewish internees from Commonwealth countries. The influx of Nazi-era Jewish refugees and then post-war displaced persons saw the New Zealand Jewish community increase to 2,500 in Wellington, meaning the Wellington Jewish community increase. And this expansion put needs on the existing synagogues, which I will talk about, the Bethel Synagogue on the terrace, and these were the early sites of Holocaust remembrance and commemoration. And this synagogue, which I will show in a moment, was earmarked for demolition to make way for a motorway for the central business district. So Wellington has an interesting kind of history of the public sites of memory. So the recent census in New Zealand of the Jewish community estimates these numbers to be around 10,000 New Zealand-born and immigrants from other countries. My argument about the lack of scholarship also relates to the problems of communication infrastructures, the fragility of recall, and the convenience in forgetting in relation to Nazi atrocities and their personal and political legacies since 1945. There was no shortage of reports to draw on, as news media, particularly in print, for example, Nazi crimes were reported in the New Zealand press outlets in terms of atrocities and horrors, from international news wires in particular, which are sometimes obviously incorrect from today's perspective of what we know about the history and geography of the Holocaust. These newspapers were from about Auschwitz, concentration camps, and mass persecution. So part of the project I'm embarking on is a massive digital humanities data mining exercise is one element of that, and is to go through the newspapers of this time. So for the period 1st of January 1944 to 1st of January 1950, 6,522 articles mention concentration camps, and camps such as Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Buchenwald regularly featured in headlines. Newspapers also carried atrocity photos, liberators' accounts, and interviews with survivors. The arrival of 2 survivors, for example, including Hansi Silberstein in Auckland, was headlined in an article from the Otago Daily Times from 15th of March 1948. Now, Otago is one of the southernmost provinces in New Zealand and extremely remote. So there's actually the communication kind of networks that are reaching all over the country. So the headline read, "Years of Horror at Nazi Concentration Camps, Survivors Reach Dominion." Obviously, we have a colonial context that we'll pay attention to as well. It was noted that 2 of the comparatively few women who survived the horrors of Auschwitz and Belsen concentration camps stepped off the Tasman Empire's Airways Skymaster when it arrived in Auckland Airport from Sydney to end a long-awaited journey to their new homes. The article itself goes into the remarkable details about persecution experiences of Hansi, and she was actually the sister of Fred Silberstein, who I mentioned earlier, and he immigrated to New Zealand to join her when he learned that she was there. And this kind of chain migration was quite common, and it continues throughout the decades of relatives joining others. Holocaust survivors arrived in New Zealand from late 1945 via the established relief networks of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, the Red Cross, the UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, later IRO, International Refugee Organization, and through private sponsorship. They did so on the ships that carried Europe's displaced persons, many of whom were stateless, and assigned the designation of the so-called hardcore, who refused or could not be repatriated to home countries for fear of reprisals, and others exiled from Cold War encroachment in their home countries. Australia and New Zealand participated, alongside the United States and Canada, in mass resettlement schemes organised by the International Refugee Organization of displaced persons after the war. New Zealand received around 5,000 displaced persons from the kind of countries we now know in the Baltic region, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Central and Southern Europe between 1949 and 1952. The first IRO ship to sail from Europe, from Trieste to Italy to New Zealand, arrived on the 26th of June 1949. It was called the Dundalk Bay and carried 932 passengers. Again, as the Otago Daily Times headline read Europe in 8 nations, including survivors of Nazi concentration camps and Jewish orphans aged 4 to 13. The characterization of the displaced persons from Europe was stark and tragic, as with the case of an unnamed Polish man who arrived with picture cards, corpses and stamps, now presented as a grim transnational souvenir of the atrocities of Mauthausen. On the front they showed either, from the newspaper it said, on the front they show either heaps of corpses or huge cremation stoves at the Mauthausen Nazi concentration camp in Austria. Austrian stamps are on the back. They have a special franking mark in English, French, German and Russian, saying May 5th, 1946, first anniversary of liberation. The Central Hawke's Bay also emphasised integration through education, new parents and opportunity for the young orphans. Perhaps optimistically so for children like Natalie Nazarov, who at 7 years old has 2 fingers missing and a deep scar on her right cheek. She only remembers a heavy bombardment in which she was wounded and nearly killed. A group of descendants of the people from the Baltic countries aboard the Dundalk Bay have committed, like the survivors I've been talking about, to commemoration initiatives, including reunions, family searching, and projects such as Untold Stories, and also heritage preservation around kind of resettlement camps. There's one in Paeatua, north of Wellington, and this was the main reception camp for displaced persons in New Zealand, having served itself as a resettlement location for Polish children who arrived, 700 or so children from Poland, or actually Central Asia, that were sponsored by the New Zealand government. And the camp itself featured in IRO immigration films promoting assimilation, the so-called Kiwi way of life. Parallel to the media coverage of arrivals was international outreach by humanitarian relief organisations based in the United Kingdom to New Zealand Jewish communities. Their fundraising tours and activism for the care and rehabilitation of Holocaust survivors extended the care lines from the DP camps in the British and American zones to the Holocaust survivors in New Zealand and also Australia. They were also returned by donations of care parcels and relief supplies, food, clothing, toys, books, and other items by Jewish and non-Jewish communities across New Zealand. This is a really fascinating story, as with other countries. This transnational coalition of care, built on the advocacy of Rabbi Alexander Astor in Auckland, who provided chaplaincy for the spiritual and emotional needs of American Jewish soldiers stationed at military bases in New Zealand. This was part of the broader network of the United States-based National Jewish Welfare Board's Care for Jewish Servicemen in the broader South Pacific Theatre of World War II, including Australia and the Philippines. And I've just published something about the Philippines case, which is very interesting indeed. So these are the survivors I'm going to introduce you to, and I'm not just introducing them to you to give you a sense of their backgrounds. The paper can't go into huge detail in terms of what they've done, because I'm still researching the actual contributions based on their personal papers and letters. But let me now share some biographical information about the survivors who immigrated to Wellington and whose late in life trajectories converged around building the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand. So born on 28th of August 1920, Hanka Svakova, she was married beforehand to her husband, which I'll talk about, Hanka Bailova. Then Pressburg, her second husband, came from a middle-class Jewish family in Rakovnik in central Bohemia. She was deported with her husband to Theresienstadt in 1942, and her family members were deported a few months before her. She was then transported to the Theresienstadt family camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau with her husband in December 1943. Her trajectory of movement aligns with the broader expansion of the Nazi concentration camp system from mid-1944 for forced labourers, since in mid-July 1944, she was selected for forced labour with a group of 1,500 Jewish, Hungarian and Czech women and transported to the sub-camps of KZ Neuengamme, Dessau, Ufer, Hamburg and Weilenberg. She remained in the sub-camp system, cleaning up bombed oil refinery areas for large companies such as Shell and Esso. These names should be familiar. She was then moved to other sub-camps, including Hamburg Neugraben and Hamburg Tiefstadt. She arrived in Bergen-Belsen sometime in late March and was liberated by the British Army on the 15th of April 1945. She recalled that leaving Auschwitz was in a way saving your life. Resident in Block 16, she saw firsthand the atrocities perpetrated against Jews and the British Army's liberation of the camp. She was transported to Hanover and from there a train to Karlsbad, today's Karlovy Vary, the first time that she'd slept in a proper bed for 3.5 years, before reaching Prague on the 6th of June 1945. It took her a year to kind of return to normal, as she put it. She ran into an old acquaintance, George or Jiri Pressburg, on a street in Prague, and they'd worked prior to the war in the same office before that, and they started to go out, and eventually they married in January 1947. George was also Jewish and from Prague and had immigrated to Great Britain and later served in the British Army. Hanka worked in one of the restitution offices in Prague, and after several months of checking tracing lists, gave up hope of finding her family, but she was able to certify ownership of her family's business and house, and the sale of the building funded the passage of a journey to New Zealand. This was sponsored by one of those earlier 1930 refugees, Fred Chinovsky. He was from Czech as well, and he'd emigrated to New Zealand in 1940. And Hanka and George immigrated in January 1949. She had 2 daughters, Carol and Susie, worked in the leather good factories. This was owned by the Chinovskys in Wellington, and the last 20 years of her life were working at the Golden Kiwi Lottery. A rather ordinary kind of occupations. Once she retired, she started a second unexpected career as a Holocaust educator and testifier, starting the first small Holocaust museum, as she called it, in the Wellington Jewish Community Centre, with items that she and George and her husband had gathered for an exhibition that accompanied the 1985 commemoration event where she first spoke publicly about the Holocaust. I'll show you in a moment what these rooms look like. This modest display laid the groundwork for the eventual Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, opening in 2012. Hunker soon became one of Wellington's spokespeople for the survivor community and a kind of Sammler or a collector, and she passed away in late 2011 at 91. Stephen Sidley, in the middle there, was born in 1934 as a child survivor of the Budapest ghetto during the Nazi occupation. He moved around multiple houses in the ghetto to survive. Between July and November 1944, he was in a Yellow Star house under Swiss protection with his grandmother, aunt, and brother. His father had been deported to Mauthausen, and his mother was sent to a holding camp predicted for transportation to Auschwitz. Stephen's story is a multi-generational account of repeated displacement and moving between apartments in the ghetto and eventual reunification with his family. His testimony often includes the experiences of his father's incarceration. Unlike Hunker, who lost all of her immediate family, Stephen's father returned to Budapest in the final months of the war. They stayed in Budapest for another 3 years, unsure of where to rebuild. The options were Hungary, Palestine, or New Zealand, and the family thought it was a left-leaning socialist paradise at the time. The appeal of New Zealand was also personal, as his uncle had immigrated there in the 1940s, some years earlier. So Stephen immigrated to New Zealand with his family with the assistance of the JDC via Budapest, Vienna, and Paris, New York, arriving in late 1948. Before he became the founding chairperson of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand at 70 years old, his working life was in the literary world and teaching. He was a bookseller, critic, and author of many publications about Jewish refugees and immigrants to New Zealand, including The Dexton Story, about Annie and Max Dexton's rescue, and their Lithuanian Jewish couple, of 20 Jewish orphans from Bialystok to New Zealand, and a pioneering biography about German Jewish refugee architect and composer, Fuchs, who I mentioned. And Fuchs's music was banned by the Nazis, and he had immigrated to New Zealand after his internment in Dachau. Unlike Hunker, Stephen did not delay sharing his Holocaust experiences with his 6 children. As he wrote in a 1993 essay, "My own thinking and value systems were colored by the experience of the Holocaust. I was a Zionist because only a Zionist stand made sense in the wake of the Holocaust. I was also a socialist because it was inequality and prejudice which led to fascism. And I grieved for a Central European culture which was corrupted to the point where it lost much of its central meaning." At 91, he remains active in Holocaust education to this day. Inge Wolf, who's there on the right, was born Ingeborg Ponger, is born in May 1934 into a Jewish family from Vienna with paternal origins in Czechoslovakia. Unlike Hunker and Stephen, Inge immigrated to London with her mother and father via support from the Czechoslovak Refugee Trust in late 1938. That resettlement meant that the Ponger family were among the 50,000 Jewish refugees from Central Europe who fled to Britain during the 1930s. While her father fought with the Czech army, Inge lived with her mother in London during the war and was not evacuated like other children at the time. It was during her mid-teens that Inge had discovered her parents had converted her to Christianity at a young age in Vienna for her protection, and then she became determined to reclaim her Jewish identity, attending Jewish social clubs and learning more about the war years in Europe while in London, where, for example, if you know about the exhibitions that have been held, the Belsen exhibition in 1945, and also the Search for the Scattered in 1947, sponsored by the World Jewish Congress. Inge and her mother remained in the UK, but life was exceedingly difficult. They never developed a serious connection to the country due to societal prejudice against Jews and refugees. There was a lack of employment opportunities in post-war Britain and also gender discrimination. Inge's father died in 1955, and again, at the encouragement of her mother's brothers who were already in New Zealand, she and her mother immigrated there in 1957. From there, she met her husband, Ronald, a photographer, and they moved to Wellington to establish what became the region's most successful photography business, Photography by Wolf. She had 2 children and was heavily involved in that business while also chairing the boards of Jewish and non-Jewish organisations, including periods as director of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand and between 2007 to 2013. And she passed away in 2021, aged 87. So really the story is, how do we insert Hanke, Stephen and Inga into this history? And there's much more of a prehistory that I'm compiling, but really this just shows you some of the kind of events that are happening at this time. And my argument is that I'm really questioning the kind of the role of the nation as such. And these are very much transnational entanglements that enable Holocaust memory to emerge. So Hanke, Stephen and Inga all contributed to building a culture of Holocaust education and remembrance in Wellington, namely in steering the opening of the Wellington Holocaust Research and Education Centre in April 2007. But the groundwork for that public visibility and need was laid decades before. But how much of that information about Nazi crimes and early Holocaust memory was retained across generations, retold and reinforced in successive, in the generations that came after, Jewish and non-Jewish, via community memory, education, scholarship and other infrastructures? And this is an issue that's common to any society, about retention and intergenerational education. As Berman notes, most studies of the aftermath position memorialization around certain key international events that motivated local memory initiatives and recognition the diaspora, such as post-war trials, including those in the British zone of Germany in the late 1940s, the Dachau trial, the Auschwitz trial, the multiple trials, two trials, Eichmann trial, in Jerusalem, mini-series, TV shows, etc. But really my goal is to go deeper than that kind of surface level. So it remains a key objective to the future research to study and map how these international events influenced the visibility, localization, or renationalization of Holocaust-related news and survivor visibility in New Zealand, and indeed in the various cities in the North and South Island. There were more important trans-Tasman factors and Jewish communal infrastructures that enabled Holocaust memory and education exchanges. And it was only later from the early, or only from the early 1980s, where events in Europe, such as Holocaust trials and commemorations, TV series, as I mentioned, film and literature from the United States, inserted that kind of distinctive visibility that is associated with Americanization. Survivor gatherings occurred in Jerusalem in 1981, Washington, D.C. in 1983, Sydney 1985, and 4 survivors from New Zealand attended the Jerusalem founders lists, and so 4 survivors attended, and many others. So there's this kind of international push for recognition. We also have the descendants gathering in Sydney in 1993 of the children of the second generation. Bilateral cooperation between Jewish organisations in Australia and New Zealand was very formative to the visibility of the Holocaust and specific Jewish resistance events, such as the anniversaries of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the 1940s, and again, these kind of film screenings. So exhibitions that occurred in Australia, say the 1980 was brought to Auckland in 1987. So it's quite a lot of kind of sharing of kind of cultural kind of practices between both countries. And it's always that New Zealand is an add-on. My argument here is actually the sense of maturity actually develops in the late 1980s, 1990s, a bit more independence. So we also have student youth groups are very important on campuses as sites of Holocaust memory as well. So this will be our goal to kind of reconstruct that kind of visibility, international youth exchanges and gatherings as well. The Australian Institute of Jewish Affairs acquired Claude Lunsman's show for screening at Melbourne festivals and at 4 film festivals in New Zealand prior to its commercial release in late 1987. And this was a momentous event there in New Zealand, as it was in many other countries. So the demand for international Holocaust-related film and literature was connected to its increasing localization and understanding. That is, the rising public awareness of the local Holocaust community, of a survivor diaspora dispersed within New Zealand and its borders, whose stories were shared with children and family initially, and in community settings such as memorial services, and either only later, and often anonymously so, to the public via radio, and then in organised testimony projects. So, as I mentioned, these were some of the kind of exhibitions, but I want to talk about the 1985 commemorations. How much time do I have in my okay? Your time? Okay, good. So this 1985 commemoration, this is from Television New Zealand, and they hold actually really very interesting archive of this material. Here we have the kind of producer talking to the survivors at a venue about what to expect in the actual commemoration that will occur. So the year 1985 was a turning point for the visibility of the survivor diaspora in New Zealand, many of whom remained reticent to, this is the actual venue for the first public sharing. The 1985 was a turning point for the visibility of the survivor diaspora, a major turning point, as I said, many of whom remained reticent to share their stories with family and the public. Documentaries from the period show the preparation, as in that earlier slide, among survivor friends and the challenges of speaking publicly. Hunker and George Pressburg were on the organising committee of the Holocaust commemoration 40th anniversary of the Holocaust and the liberation of the camps. The event included speeches by the Prime Minister David Lange, here, a visiting psychologist, Edith Eger, here, and from the United States. And the event's highlight was not noted in the invitation, was a segment featuring Ian Fraser, a very famous journalist, in conversation with Hunker and a friend, Roma. And here they are, there's Hunker, Roma, and Ian Fraser. The May 5th event delivered a reality that had been missing in Wellington's public landscape, the visibility of the individual survivor experience and the public's physical accessibility to them in a concert hall. This watershed event initiated the public's deep interest in the Holocaust survivor diaspora. Trans-Tasman initiatives continued between New Zealand Jewish organisations such as B'nai B'rith, the Women's International Zionist Organisation, the New Zealand Jewish Council, and with their Australian counterparts in the 1980s and 90s. Before the New Zealand survivor diaspora started to become more independent, sharing their experiences with the public via interviews, school talks, public talks, and educational initiatives. Hunker continued to give interviews and became one of these, as I mentioned, very important spokespersons for the survivor community and one of its central agents in gathering artefacts. The trajectories to public speaking among the survivor community at this time were also shaped parallel to government priorities and policies around assimilation and identity in a former settler colonial state, now a bicultural Maori Pakeha model. The ongoing arrival of European, Asian, and African diaspora groups from conflicts in Southeast Asia and Africa, and the material legacies of the loss of culture, language, and land, and in the case of Maori groups, reparation through the claims process of the Waitangi Tribunal, which is the treaty claims resolution process that began in 1978 to settle claims for displacement due to British colonisation. All of these contributed to a hesitation among the survivor community with self-identifying as a refugee, a victim, and a survivor. So I just want to show you a bit of, if I can. Yeah, there we go. Just a bit at the start of this documentary. Just 2 minutes. This is the one that was produced by the New Zealand Jewish Council.
Hunker Pressburg resides in Wellington, New Zealand with her second husband, whom she married just after liberation at the close of World War II. They arrived here as Jewish refugees after having lost both their families to the Nazi death camps. But Hunker herself endured those camps. She is a survivor. At the Wellington Jewish Community Centre, she shares that experience with others in the belief that those atrocities should not be forgotten. Her story takes us back to her hometown of Rakovník in Czechoslovakia, to the year just prior to the German takeover of Prague.
There was no compensation whatsoever.
Good morning, Liata. How are you?
Today, Roma Heerman manages a small leather goods factory in Wellington, left to her by her late second husband. She arrived in New Zealand on the 30th of November 1947 with her mother. They were refugees from Poland. Together, they had survived the Holocaust. But Roma's first husband, her father and her sister, had not. They were 3 of the 6 million Jews who had perished at the hands of the Nazis. But in the early months following the German invasion of Poland, the family was together, living at home in the town of Tomas Almaz.
Okay.
Fritz Silberstein believed he had lost all his family to the Holocaust. But in 1949, he learned that his sister was living in New Zealand. So he traveled here to be with her and started a new life in Auckland, where he lives today. But those earlier years as a young Jewish boy living under Nazi rule, he cannot forget. That childhood was set amidst the anti-Semitism of pre-war Germany, where he lived with his parents and sister in Berlin.
Just stop there, but that video is openly available online. Okay, so part of the argument is visibility is also where these discussions are taking place, so the public arena. So locations of visibility of the survivor diaspora and these venues for testimony giving depended on the audience, but also whether in synagogues, annual commemorations, and public arenas. So let us step inside a few of them. So the historical synagogue on the terrace on this left image, and the Wellington Jewish Community Centre on the right, opened in 1977. They both played a critical role in the evolution of Holocaust remembrance in the capital, with the former on the left there providing the space of the Wellington Jewish community's observances of Yom HaShoah and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from the late 1940s, through to larger and public participation at annual commemoration services at the Wellington Jewish Community Centre, there on your right. That latter location provided the home space of various Holocaust rooms, as I'll explain in a moment, and the current home of the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, alongside the Beth El Synagogue and the Jewish Kindergarten. The physical sites of the community on the right-hand side were complemented, as I mentioned, by these written initiatives, oral history projects about citizenship, initiated by non-Jewish groups, which included survivors and national groups of refugees, such as the Czechs. Memoirs by survivors and their children also occupy a distinct memory space, but those publications did not emerge until the early 2000s. Now, one important location for the physical availability were Jewish community spaces and the public's access to them. Unlike counterparts in Melbourne and Sydney, which opened museums to the Holocaust and Jewish history in 1984 and 1992 respectively, and have undergone massive renovations in the last 3 years. Physically public spaces of Holocaust exhibits have never exceeded more than one room. They've remained secluded rather than standalone. These are small community memorial rooms filled with artifacts from European hometowns and camps and of the persecution trajectories. They have identification documents, and theirs are enlivened and animated by survivors and their testimony. They do not exceed around 50 square metres in size, a self-spatial recognition of the Jewish community's smallness, and without the walk-through flow and emotionally reflective spaces that typify well-known museums with extensive Holocaust exhibitions. So this one on the left is this is actually the Auckland War Memorial Museum, now known as the Auckland Museum. And the survivors in Auckland first got together with the museum staff to open this gallery, and this was in 1997. And the internal exhibits have not really changed for almost 30 years or so. And we tried to do this many years ago when I was in New Zealand. And again, this was a kind of funding issue. Inside the Wellington Jewish Community Centre, as I mentioned, this was Hunter and talking about her artifacts and the display in the Holocaust Museum, as she called it, from 1990. On the other side there, we have the kind of opening of the Wellington Holocaust Research and Education Centre itself, just a room with the survivors and their children here. And at the bottom, this was the Wellington Jewish Community Centre, again, housed the expanded and enlarged Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, a larger room again. So it's all this kind of protection within the Jewish community space where there's kind of rent, cost concerns, as well, budgetary considerations too. So this small Holocaust museum is what Hunker and George called it, opened in 1990. It included also a Holocaust memorial book, and then, as I've mentioned, the Auckland Museum opened there in 1997. The desecration of an estimated 80 headstones in 2 Jewish cemeteries in Wellington between July and August 2004, including the headstone of Ronald Wolfe, Inga's husband, was seen by some commentators as a response to then Prime Minister Helen Clark's condemnation of Israel over the sentencing of 2 Mossad agents for attempting to enter the country with kind of illegally obtained passports. So separate to this Holocaust history is a really intense Israel-New Zealand relationship as well. And this also affects how the public responded to Holocaust memory. So as much as I'm talking about visibility, in fact, we can see reasons not to be so visible in this context too. So this event of the desecrations coincided with the New Zealand Jewish Council's condemnations of attempts to allow David Irving to enter the country for a public speaking tour, again amid increasing right-wing activity, including marches and assemblies. This is still a problem in New Zealand. It was in this context, including the desecrations, that Stephen Sedley pushed ahead with the idea of opening a Holocaust Centre, as in the Wellington Holocaust Research and Education Centre up there in 2007. And this would include personal artefacts from Europe and feature the stories of 3 also survivors. So the contributions of Hanke, Stephen and Inga to Holocaust commemoration were immense. Their diverse Europe to New Zealand trajectories made visible and audible what had been a distant suffering and contributed to the recognition of the local survivor diaspora with diverse and complex histories of displacement and renewal. The Holocaust Centre of New Zealand expanded to a larger room in 2012 in the Wellington Jewish Community Centre and has since sponsored locally designed and curated exhibitions, annual commemorations, secondary schools and university groups, visiting academics and workshops, and also with the recently translated Diary of Anne Frank into Te Reo Maori marks another step of kind of cultural kind of integration and outreach. So all of this kind of brings us to a sense of kind of reclamation and recovery that I'm attempting to examine through, it will be a kind of large project. So where do the, not just where the survivors kind of reside, but where is their archive? And how do I reunify the individuals with their archive and insert them back into their European trajectories? So it's a sense of some of these kind of maps that I've done, we can get a sense of some complications that the kind of, even the word diaspora in New Zealand is very difficult to think about. I'm just going to show you here. On this map, this might be better. So here in blue are the kind of origins of the New Zealand survivor diaspora based on the 1997 interviews. And this is a really discrete archive, but it's not a comprehensive archive of all the survivors and refugees. But in itself, it offers a glimpse of memory at this time, memory and testimony giving. So these locations, and with diaspora, how many people need to be in a place to have a diaspora? Right? There's a really interesting problem here of micro-diasporas within the country. We have lots of Jewish philosophy about diasporas, ethnicity. So we have this dispersion in Europe. And then we have the movement, and I've just put in some post-war locations of post-war recent Jewish immigration to New Zealand as well in orange. But then when we go to New Zealand, these are the interview locations. So quite dispersed across the island. But then when we look at the European origins of the birth cities, it's very much Hungarians, Germans, the Dutch, and the Austrians. So another aspect there, once I kind of can see the geography, is actually to create these kind of basic memory, as I've said, these kind of aggregators, to actually find them in the archives and to create lineages for each individual of where they were and their archives, and insert them back into the European persecution geography. So that's one kind of side component of this project. So within this small space resides the excess of this history. Just go back here. Yeah, within this small space resides the excess of the history it exhibits and the survivors' disrupted lives who populate its curated walls and video content. This recurrence of the theme of smallness is not accidental. The smallness of the Jewish community of New Zealand, always in the shadow of its larger neighbour. This is a one-way correspondence that Australians do not look at New Zealand really except for tourism and trade. But also we have much more New Zealanders because of remoteness. It is constantly looking globally and outwards, right? And this was the case with Holocaust memory infrastructures. New Zealand does not really appear in any kind of Australian historiography, right, of the Holocaust memory. So the smallness of the communities most certainly shaped the trajectories of visibility, the reach of international and educational projects, and testimony practices. But as I said, it was the visit of the USC Shoah Foundation from Melbourne in December 1997, and they were funded by Australian donors to come to New Zealand to undertake these interviews, and there was some resistance by the Australians, certain people, to have that happen for reasons yet to be discovered. And this inserted a European origin to a profound displacement story. So spending 2 weeks in the country, the team of interviewers recorded these 53 interviews as mapped there. So I've mapped all of these kind of locations, but they're yet to be accurately geolocated. In Auckland, Wellington, and other cities on the North and South Island. But many people also in the community did not participate, either because they felt uncomfortable in speaking about their experiences or did not self-identify with what was then a camp-centric definition of a survivor. So, unlike in Melbourne or Sydney, there is no standalone Holocaust museum in New Zealand. Wellington's public spaces of memory and connection to the Holocaust remain secluded within the walls of the city's Jewish Community Centre, itself up for sale because it cannot afford the upkeep of the community. Its Holocaust story is deeply connected to the Jewish experience in its exhibits, but now very much transcends that physicality through its educational programming, via values-driven learning in secondary schools and the demands of teachers for comparative history approaches and outreach to interfaith communities, all delivered via in-person meetings, digital platforms, and connections to objects. Exhibitions about rescued and relocated Jewish children and adults pop up at local history museums and libraries across the North and South Island, and volunteers and goodwill provide the labour of education and memory work, as with many underfunded museums whose activities are determined by ad hoc project funding, rather than sustained government investment in operations and people. The diminishing numbers in the survivor diaspora in New Zealand today follow international trends. In its 2025 report, Holocaust Survivors Worldwide, a demographic overview, the Claims Conference estimated that there were around 2,200 survivors in Oceania, meaning Australia, and less than 100 in the rest of the region, defined as French Polynesia, New Caledonia, and New Zealand. These figures report the inevitable decline of the remnant. But what about the whole that came before it, which has never been accurately quantified in its European demographic origins, nor mapped in its transmigration or internal New Zealand geography? This introduction to the trajectories of visibility of the Holocaust survivor community points to complicated and certainly not new issues about the fate of small Jewish communities in the global geographic South, and how they were supported and written about in terms of advocacy infrastructures and their future survival or worse, extinction by international Jewish communal organisations and research institutes. As I hope to have shown, there is much to be gained from reclaiming just a few of the factors that shaped the trajectories of how the Holocaust survivor in Aotearoa, New Zealand, emerged and regenerated in the Holocaust's global aftermath. Thank you. I'm just okay, sure. Okay, any immediate questions first? If I can say,
Thank you for speaking on a topic that's absolutely no idea for. What I want to ask is if you could say a bit more about what is the practical, but also maybe intellectual relationship between the memory of the Holocaust and other memories in New Zealand. So you already alluded in your talk that some of the survivors were resistant to come forward because obviously they found themselves in moment in the 70s and 80s of proclamation of Maori rights and all that stuff. So what is the kind of relationship more broadly between Holocaust memory and other memories in the country? And so, in this country, the imperial memory of the empire, Roderick talks about multidimensional memory as Holocaust enabling other memories potentially. I wonder how this looks like in your lifetime.
Can we check if people heard the question in Zoom, or do we need to repeat?
Do you want more questions or question answer? Sorry, whatever.
I'll repeat.
Oh, the question, yeah, I hope I'm reflecting, testing my active listening skills, was about the relationship between Holocaust memory in New Zealand and older memories in New Zealand.
Yeah, now? Okay. Yeah, okay.
So
So I think it's a big question, because it's a broad question, right? And there's so many. There's World War One, there's the Anzac history, you've got the British colonial history of settlement, you've got the military history, and then you have the kind of other humanitarian histories of New Zealand in terms of bringing in people from, Indochina, Africa, for example. But the biggest, I would say, it's kind of military British. It's World War II in terms of the kind of more immediate context, in terms of participating in a kind of broader cultural event. We have many people in New Zealand Armed Forces who were liberated, or some participated in liberations, who were exposed to atrocities. We also have the Polish children who came from Central Asia and Iran. They were brought out by the New Zealand government. So there's a kind of history of humanitarian enablement, military service. That's in the 1940s. And then there's a kind of, what happens in the post-war period is more integration and kind of not a disappearance, but a seclusion. And then it's actually international events that I think revive international events, but we also have a Maori kind of situation, a Maori Pakeha model that I mentioned before. So it really, it's hard to actually pick out exactly, but this is very much tied with kind of Jewish histories of immigration in the country since 1850s, 60s. But then the Holocaust is actually recorded on in the 1930s. It's such a broad history that it's difficult to kind of actually say how it's enabled. But a big it was in the 1990s and early 2000s when there were debates about the use of the term Holocaust and genocide. And Prime Minister and the Holocaust denial, but Prime Minister kind of came out and said, the Holocaust was reserved for the European Holocaust. So there's actually, how do we speak about, which I alluded to, displacement, dispossession, and how are those words and that kind of semantic understanding used at this time? So it's very broad, and it's a deeply integral to various issues. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but it's a broader.
Yeah, it is a just don't answer, you can give you 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, sure.
Yeah, thank
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Yes, I had a question originally in mind, but I'm going to build on that comment, if I may, ask about whether you can comment on any sense of alignment or fellow feeling between indigenous populations in New Zealand and Holocaust survivors. In the same way as you can see that, I think, quite actively in Australia. To the point where I think a number of Pacific Islanders and a number of the first peoples of Australia, led by someone called Nova Paris, are very partisan in terms of their support of Israel at the moment. Do you detect anything of that kind of alignment going on?
I mean, it's a longer history again, and all I can say is I would like to think in terms of allyship, and there is immense allyship with the Jewish community in New Zealand and with the Holocaust survivor community. And there has been, even from the Catholic churches, Church of England, the Maori community, etc. And this actually precedes, I don't know if there's anything that's parallel to what happened in Australia, where we have William Cooper protesting in the 1930s.
Right, yeah.
Right, so that's still to be discovered. But there were certainly protests in Wellington around Nazi policies, for example, in the 1942.
Mhm.
So we need to kind of investigate more. This is part of our project, is actually to go into Maori language newspapers
Right,
and actually investigate if there is this kind of allyship, because we can look at organisations, we can look at media reportage, for example, and the Maori King and there's strong support for the Jewish community, strong support for Holocaust causes, and there always has been. But you then have the politicization and the weaponization of Holocaust memory and Zionism and State of Israel, right? So they can't be disentangled, right? They are all there, and especially since October 7th, this has got, what you said about this is actually far, you know, the Indigenous communities, there's many, you know, obviously, you know, kind of pro-Palestine events and protests is also happening in Wellington, Justice for Palestine and many others, and many Jewish community or members of the community are involved in that too.
Right.
So we can't really draw straight lines, but the history, yes, is definitely one to be investigated to look at that history of allyship. And I think it is there, but we have to go to non-English sources to find out. Yeah.
thank you. My original question. Original question, might betray the fact that I wasn't quite clear myself.
Okay.
I didn't quite work out about the push-pull factors in survivors arriving in New Zealand. How far were they brought to New Zealand? And how far was there a choice? And I find the choice fascinating in terms of remoteness and isolation, almost a sense of, if it happened that there was choice, a sense of getting as far away as humanly possible on this earth from Europe, from the site of
Definitely. The distance is a big factor.
We'll repeat the question.
Oh,
Okay, just put it. Oh, she's put it already. You are so.
thank you.
Yeah, so there was both combination push and pull. There's cases I cited were from, you know, chain migration of the Czech national groups and others, so family. This was big, but New Zealand also had a very restrictive immigration policy. So it was very hard. It was probably, you know, you needed sponsorship to get to the country. So it was a mixture of push and pull. Many people who went to New Zealand stayed for years and then went to Australia.
Right.
So it's like a kind of trans-Tasman diaspora of survivors in between both countries. So it's interesting in itself. But it is a push and pull. But it's also about, you know, occupations. So we've found information about, you know, different occupations of the group, what was in demand,
Right.
where could their skills be utilised.
Skills.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Noshka? My colleagues on right? And it's about the demographic of the Jewish community today.
Yeah.
I assume the fact that the community is smaller is it's a relation or movement out of New Zealand. But both the Jewish community there now and those who've left, is there a dynamic of second and third generation memory culture or research? And for those who then left New Zealand, is it just New Australia? Does that mean that there is some New Zealand third generation memory culture of what's happening elsewhere in the world?
Of course, there's a diaspora of that after generations. I mean, I actually think it's not so much, it is about the kind of memory, but it's about employment and opportunity, right? People wanting to travel abroad and join other Jewish community, be involved in kind of Jewish community group youth groups. So there's in fact, these small countries almost push themselves to, they splinter because of this kind of lack of employment locally. And so this is not a kind of New Zealand story in a way, but there is a kind of a dispersion. In fact, many of the Jews in New Zealand today are Israeli, you know, and that's been happening over so many years, South African, Russian, Ukrainian, etc. So, but there is also within the people who came, there's the people who left, and they reintegrate in other communities. So second, third generation, and in fact, the kind of generations after, as I call them, they have a much of their own memory culture as part of reparations and restitution, provenance, memoir writing, performance. So that is again another big factor. It's not dissimilar from what's happening in, say, the United States or Australia. It's actually what makes, I think, New Zealand distinct, or what I want to find out if it is distinct, is the New Zealand now is experiencing immense immigration departures, right? This is a huge problem for the country. So it's always had a kind of, why do I stay and how can I be gainfully employed? Do I go to London on my gap year? Do I go to Australia, Melbourne or Sydney? So we have lots of Jewish groups in, New Zealanders within those groups and adult groups as well. So there is that micro diaspora as well.
Great question, thanks, Kanishka. Yeah.
Yeah, you briefly mentioned it in terms of the USC, not something else fine because of focus on cap. I'm wondering, is there a difference in the community of those that arrived in the 30s and those that came post-war? Is there a difference in how they've been taken into the community and through memory work as a whole? And two, you briefly mentioned that the other again about the kind of outreach work that a lot of these centres do in terms of school groups. You mentioned that interfaith work. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, because that strikes me as a much more active thing in terms of, because the spaces that you mentioned, as you said, are very kind of siloed within the Jewish community within more, I'm assuming that football isn't that great within them.
That is quite a lot.
But like when they're going out and obviously reaching more people, right? So that seems like a very active way of what they're doing. So what's that? I suppose what is that very similar facing, who's doing it, all those sort of questions.
Sure, okay. I'll start with the second one first. There's always been a kind of a tendency to engage with non-Jewish communities, but also schools is a big part of the remit. So the New Zealand curriculum is very much values driven. And so they had to kind of design educational programming that aligned to the New Zealand curriculum around values. And whether or not those values aligned to, say, the survivor trustees of the group, right, is another thing. So you have public demand for the kind of universalization of the Holocaust. Tell us the values that can be, derived from the Holocaust that have universal applicability. How do you actually balance the Jewish aspect of the Holocaust within that storytelling and resources? What are the actual, tools you can use? And are you reaching out, say, for the Christchurch, the terror attacks that happened? There was a big push to actually say, what's the responsibility of the Holocaust Education Centre, the Holocaust Centre? How do we educate against, intolerance and extremism? Now, is that their remit, or is that the remit of other organisations? So there are various demands to be put on, and these are the kind of internal questioning is constant for a predominantly volunteer organisation without recurrent government funding. So it's like it's not the same as, say, like a HET. There's no HET to do that kind of work. So the work is very much, they generate income from school groups for certain kinds of programming. But you have students going there, you have educators and exhibitions going out to those locations around the country. But it's very much, I would say, tending more to universalization, to kind of talk about relevance, which to me is actually kind of diminishing the historical aspect for me. Because leading back into your question about the refugee and the survivors, what we're going to kind of explore is this idea of semantic convergence, yeah? Because the refugees that you talk about, they were pretty much, the dominant group who were written about at the time and covered. And it was really their first memoir of writing about them in the 1980s that came out. And not so much for the survivors. First, it was actually the memoirs about survivors before the histories. There's still no history of the survivor group. This is what we're going to do. But the people who talked about in the 1990s interviews, we don't yet know how they were found, identified by the team, right? Or people put up their hands, or are they in the community? Do they self-identify as Jewish, or are they hidden child? And my experiences weren't the same as someone who's in a camp. I'm not going to be interviewed. But in the Shoah Foundation interviews, you have all groups. This is what's interesting. So it actually does that work of convergence in those interviews, which is probably the first time, because still the refugees and still say, oh, I wasn't in a camp, I don't really count in that way. So there's still that kind of exclusion that's self-imposed. But it's the broader definition as anyone who's affected between 1933 and 1945. So there's a lot of internal kind of reckoning that still is being resolved. Yeah, and in the second, I think in the second and third generations more so.
Is there a hand, Jane?
Got a question about
Unless we're about to ask those questions.
One, I'm too sure how much the data one.
Not yet. I've just identified the broad.
That's what I would ask. Which is more about you, and about digital data. If the project starts when you were there, or is it something you've only thought about since you've been here? And just, how much did you own positioning in terms of
Yeah, look, it started when I was kind of there, because everything I was there to kind of incubate and put in, you know, infrastructures, teaching, courses to professionalize the centre, as well. So it's kind of continued, and we wrote about the, you know, the refugee groups because their archives are readily available. But the survivor group, not so much. So the testimonies are the really first real discrete kind of unit of archive that we have. But there's others in the New Zealand Film and Sound Archive. There's actually quite a lot there. But I think my issue was like I didn't really go into the survivor. I did have lots to do with the survivors there and talk to them, and I helped with editing publications about survivors and whatnot. But I felt it was almost like too close to it. And now I have a kind of obviously geographic distance from that to be able to do that, but also I think more perspective about what the issues are on an international scale to actually to be able to insert this history into international history of the Holocaust, which we don't have at the moment. We have a very Eurocentric American perspective. So it's really to kind of even rethink the adequacy of that literature that predominates as lenses to explore the New Zealanders. And that goes with the diaspora as well. It's very different, given the small numbers.
Joe, question two.
another question too about rights and the time there.
Any other audience questions? Okay, maybe I can use my rights as chair and ask you a question.
Sure.
Just in the mic.
Sorry. You've told us a bit, Simone, about how you came to the topic. And I wonder if you could just say a bit more about where you see it going, because you showed us a glimpse of your kind of digitised archival work that you're starting to do. Where do you see this going? Good answer.
Well, what I'm doing at the moment is compiling a huge chronology. I want to a huge base level of primary source chronology of what's happening by dates. And this actually happens with, you know, we have Israel Brody, the chief rabbi here. It's a Commonwealth history, right? He's making tours to New Zealand and Australia. You have many people going out to Australia and New Zealand and after the war. So there's a bigger history there. So I want to kind of do like archives discovery. And I've got some kind of ideas about what I would like kind of to do, but most definitely is a chronological way to study that, like use the biography of the community to actually write a global history of them and their entanglements. Even though they're very small, they're actually internationally connected, transnationally with Australia, United States, Israel, Europe. And then really I want to reunify the generations back with their hometowns in the end. So it's really telling a kind of circular story of origins and ongoings in a way. But yeah, primary source was the first one.
So no big deal. Bringing questions at you. I'm so excited by the translation of America's Diary, Maori. I'm wondering if you could say something about how unusual of a moment culturally that was, or whether that's part of the broader.
So this is an interesting thing, and I think this is kind of culmination. So much trying to understand what you're talking about, but this is actually done by a Dutch a person who was in the Dutch resistance, and he came to New Zealand in the 1940s, and he's really been at the forefront of Holocaust memory. In kind of he brought the Anne Frank exhibition to Australia and New Zealand. He's done so much in this respect, and this is why he kind of said, okay, I'm going to fund. The interesting thing that he said that I'm going to kind of fund the translation because your experience is similar to our experience. Whether or not you agree with this is another question, but this is the kind of position also of seeking connection in these kind of small societies, right? And that's actually now put in all New Zealand schools. So it's like, it's an incredible kind of thing. And now there's that Anna Frank memorial, which I can show you. This was just unveiled. And the big history that we're also going to explore is that of Anna Frank, of course, ubiquitous globally. But she is really the first real Holocaust victim in New Zealand, international victim. And it is her, the kind of publication, staging all around the country with family archive of plays and performances where to Maori communities, to outreach where they've never heard of the Holocaust, but they're hearing it through this story. She is the constant through which the survivor story is actually communicated. Even today, you have Holocaust survivors in New Zealand and you'll have their picture on the front. Right? So there's this internet, it's almost like a displacement. Yeah? And the way to kind of to identify it's the Holocaust is you have this international person as being the poster for this access and communication, right? Rather than the many survivors. So there's some really deep issues going on there about how they converge and diverge. And really our project will hopefully unpack what these issues are.
Sounds brilliant, thank you. Was there a comment in there? No.
Yeah, there was.
Oh, there was one? Oh, sorry. Oh,
Cool, yeah, great. Any lasting thoughts? No, Simone, anything else you'd like to add? No pressure.
Watch this space.
We'll keep our eyes peeled for more news. Please join me in thanking Simone again for a talk.